Small Changes by Digits 27, Chapter 39. Official returns. There was a comforting familiarity to seeing his team waiting for him at the village gates, looking just as expectant as their first C-rank mission. With the distraction of the war and the revelation that he would be a father, he hadn't had time to consider just how much he missed this. It seemed that his old getting tuning now. The lot of them felt the same way, although not everything was the same. They were all older for one, with both the girls beginning to grow into their bodies. The red slip of a dress that had looked so ridiculous on Ame when Uncle was first trying to boost her confidence now showed off some developing curves. Sakura looked at every bit the medic nin she was training to be, with the professional ponytail keeping her long hair in order, and her old dress swapped out for a shirt, shorts, and a packed strap on her waist. Sasuke continued to honor the style of the Uchiha, with their high-collared shirts proudly emblazoned with the red and white fan. However, he no longer looked like a kid playing dress-up, trying to emulate the adults around him. Now he looked the part of the hardened Uchiha shinobi, even adopting a long nadachi from his family's armory. He wouldn't be a match for Ami's swordsmanship anytime soon, but with his Sharingan reflexes, he was still a menace with the blade. Hiruzen hadn't been too vocal about it, but Naruto knew the old man wasn't too keen on this excursion, whether it was sentimentality for his wayward student. Tsunade had been allowed to wander around unopposed for this long for a reason, or because of how recently Naruto had come into his role as Hokage. The redhead couldn't say. He could understand the last point. The inaugural celebration had been only the other day, and already it appeared that Naruto was absconding from his duties. Still, Naruto trusted the village to run under Hiruzen's steady hand for a few weeks. For the few weeks he might be gone. Besides, he really didn't trust anyone else who would be able to bring the wandering Shanin back. Not because he didn't trust his ninja, it was because Tsunade. It was Tsunade he didn't trust. From what he knew of the legendary medic, she didn't take kindly to unwanted news. After war, he couldn't really afford a couple of Ambu limping back to the village with broken bones. Hey, Sensei, Ami called as the trio spotted his approach, only to smirk theoretically. Sorry. Good morning, Hokage-sama. Sakura slapped her arm in exasperation at the teasing, but even the Piquette was smiling tightly. You know, I technically have the power to demote you now, Naruto shot back as he joined the group, nodding a greeting at Sasuke. Ami's eyes widened almost comically as she floundered for a moment. It was nice to see Uncle hadn't gotten her hooks in the girl completely. Well, anyways, looking great, good, looking pretty good, sensei. Very Hokage. Her two teammates just looked at her incredulously. Very Hokage. Sasuke repeated, his deadpan somehow managing to sound both amused and scathing. Sakura was grinning, and might I add, the sky looks very airy today, wouldn't you say, Sasuke? The Uchiha nodded, a smirk pulling at his lips, and Konoha seems just a bit city, briefly ignoring Ame's indignant defense of her rushed choice of words. Naruto stole a glance down at himself. He still wasn't quite comfortable with his new look, even though Uncle had insisted. What's wrong with the way I look? Naruto asked, feeling a tad affront as he glanced down at his clothes. The Jonin jacket, improved to hold a lot more than it used to, was extremely practical, and the lightweight pants and sleeveless vest allowed him full mobility. His knee-high sandals, some boots, were affection of his father's youth, resized of course, and the simple arm guards connected to the back-plated fingernails. Gloves complete the look. In lieu of anything to sew it onto, he now wore his tie on his forehead again. Admittedly, he had considered getting something like his father's iconic Haori made, but he wasn't just a clone of his father, no matter how awesome the damn coat was. Nothing. I think it makes you look rugged. Uncle consulted lightly, running a finger up his exposed arm that sent a shiver down his spine. I'm just saying you look too much like, well, Jonin. Naruto's eyebrow rose. I am a Jonin. He thumbed the olive jacket to that effect. No, you're the Hokage, Uncle retorted, poking him in the chest for a good measure. Which is why she reached under the bed, taking something off the secret panel Naruto knew about but ignored for her privacy. I got you this. She handed him a large flat box with a bright smile. He eyed it warily for a moment. Gifts from Uncle would go one of two ways, but after a moment he decided that the slight anxious smile she wore was too genuine to be a prank and opened it. He was a little surprised at what he first took to be a shirt, but when he opened it up, it turned out to be a hair-ring. It wasn't nearly as long as his father's, only going down to the top of his legs, and it was longer in the sleeve, just about covering his elbow. More importantly, it was a vibrant red, not quite the deep bloody color of his hair, but the bright, joyful red of the Hokage hat. He somehow knew they were supposed to be worn in concert. After a moment of just admiring it, he realized Uncle was still waiting for a response. I I know it wasn't really I know it won't really go with the flak jacket, red and green and all that. It but it's got more pockets than I think even you could use. I made sure to give the guy the specifications for those bigger on the inside seals you like so much. So plenty of room. It's made out of the same material as the Ambu uniform, so it won't tear easily. Although I've got a couple spares for when you inevitably find a way. I mean, I know you didn't want any. I don't. I know. I know you don't want. Yeah, you didn't want everyone thinking you're copying your dad, but I thought it was different though, but still enough to honor him. And Naruto thought it was the most adorable thing in the world when his fiancée rambled, but he finally put her out of her misery, out of her suffering by silencing her with a kiss. I love it, he whispered, holding her for a moment before letting her go to try the thing on. After shucking his flak jacket, he found it was a great fit. He had to admit it gave him something of a distinguished look. He supposed that was somewhat important for a Hokage. Well, of course you do, Uncle asserted, recovering admirably. I picked it out after all. Her look admittedly took a sultry turn. Now where's my thanks? Admittedly, he didn't wear the Hori for very long that night, but there was something to be said for waking up the next day and finding it hanging there right next to his father's. The word legacy couldn't help but spring to mind. The Hokage hat did in fact complement the Hiyori quite nicely, as he had found out when Hiruzen had handed it to him and he had cheerfully slung it on his back. He didn't remember everything he'd said to the awaiting crowds from up on the Hokage's tower. He had this whole speech planned out about success and the will of fire, but in the end he was too caught up in the excitement and adrenaline of the moment to remember it. They had cheered fairly loudly though, so he couldn't have botched it too badly. Sensei, he started when he realized Ame was tugging on his sleeve. It was still rather novel. He had a sleeve to tug. Sorry, zoned out a bit. He glanced up and took note that they had started moving. He recognized the stretch of country road they were on. Instantly, he had used this route out of the village too many times to count, and estimated they were about 5 minutes out of the gate. That was about enough to reach the threshold where the village stopped frowning on Shinobi moving too quickly. Time to pick up the pace. He grinned and took up a little jog, slowly increasing his speed. His students threw glances at one another with thinly veiled irritation. They knew what was coming. He was rather proud with how well they kept up with his punishing pace. Some green Ambu recruits would have balked an hour ago. He really had trained them well. Even Ami and Sakura, who used to be exhausted by a brief sprint through the village, were only breathing heavily by the time he wound up back to a more manageable pace. They didn't even complain about the slight sheen of sweat. Was that really necessary, Sensei? Ame gasped, already using the technique he taught them to quickly to regulate the breathing and promote recovering. We don't even have a solitude location on Lady Sonali. Maybe, but that means we'll just have to search harder and faster. I want this mission over with as soon as possible. Although he knew that it was slightly optimistic, Sonade was known to wander in what appeared to be a random pattern, but she was far more skilled at avoiding detection than her occasional drunken rampage let on. How else was she able to escape all her various deaths so far? Still, no use wasting the time he had with his students. Last I know, Saitens was Ebisuro guy up in the north. We still have a fair way to go, so I figured I'd teach you each a new technique. He'd been anticipating the sparkle that entered their eyes immediately. Younger shinobi were easy like that. We won't be stopping often, so I expect you guys to learn on the go. He could already see that wouldn't be a problem from the determined looks they each adopted. Sakura, I know how much the MedCorp stresses dodging in the field, ironically because of the very woman they were now tracking down, but sometimes that just isn't an option. He ran through hand seals purposely slowly, both to show them off and because this wasn't a jutsu he used often. When he slammed his foot down, a thick wall of stone rose up in the middle of the road. Dotan Doryu Heki. He checked to make sure the pinkhead was paying attention, usually for blocking routes to your position, and if made strong enough, can even stop a Fujitsu from breaking. He casually wound up a Rasengan in a hand and shoved it through the wall. It's not indestructible, he warned up pride well enough as Sakura nodded seriously. She'd figured out the strength and weaknesses of technique for herself. She was a smart girl. Sasuke, he nearly chuckled at how the Uchiha straightened, Sharingan nearly spinning in anticipation. I noticed your fondness for the little flame hands trick of yours, so I thought you'd appreciate this. It was one of the few pure fire manipulation techniques I was able to scrounge up. His hands entered the rat seal, and after a moment's focus, twin streams of fire erupted from each of his hands. A moment later, they intensified and shrank until he was holding two white-hot knives of fire in each hand, draining, but they can cut through damn near anything. He tossed the Uchiha a pair of thick gloves from one of his many new pockets. Thank you, uncle, and gave the younger Chunin a level stare. Be careful learning and using this technique. It's not only dangerous for your enemy. Again, he waited until he was sure the warning had been taken on board. He had such good students. Finally, he turned to the last of the trio. The Violet was nearly bouncing with unrestrained excitement. She had been a bit harder to plan for, while the utility for the others two techniques were apparent. Ame was a bit more straight-laced. She was a skilled kenjutsu practitioner. That much was obvious, but it wasn't all that defined. But it wasn't all that defined her. She was creative, often the brains behind some of the Team 7's crazier but no less effective strategies. Really, what she needed was a versatile tool that she could work into her own unique blend of skills. It was a good thing Naruto was so well traveled then. This one might be a bit trickier on me, as I can't really profess to know the technique myself. I've only seen it in use and reverse re-engineered what I could. Fu wouldn't be happy with him, but then she was already a prisoner of the village, and it wasn't like he'd stolen the technique or anything. It was a credit to Ami that the Violet didn't seem at all put off by his hesitance. As far as I can tell, the kunoichi he used it applies a thin layer of wind chakra to the sole of her feet, sort of like the water walking exercise, but as a nature transformation. Then you expand and contract the chakra to the timing of your movements, and his eyes narrowed a moment in concentration as he slowly began to bounce on one foot. Slowly, though, it wasn't the ground he was bouncing on as he rose into the air bit by bit. Finally, he lost focus. He hadn't really spent a lot of time trying to learn this before realizing he had better ways of moving faster and dropping back to the ground. Well, you get the idea. The only reason he'd gotten as far as he had with the Taki Jinchuriki signature jutsu was his extensive experience with Futon Chakra during his work on the complete Rasengan, helpful for maneuvering around a battlefield or escape if need be. He regretted adding that last note as he noticed some of the enthusiasm drained from Ami's posture too soon, perhaps. Still, when you master it, and he then no doubt and he had no doubt that she would, given time. You'll have a means of moving incredibly fast, silently, and unpredictably. Kami knew it had given him the runaround the first time he was forced to deal with it. With that little reinformation, Ami nodded, turning to look curiously at her feet. Right. Now you've all had a chance to recover. He took a moment to savor the sweet horror that entered their eyes. Let's get going. A Bisura guy isn't getting any younger. How hard could it be? How hard could it be to track down somebody that famous, anyways? He should have known better than to tempt the gods. Tsunade was a wily one, even with their rather distinctive description. She was able to completely elude all of her pursuers with what had to be practiced ease. It wasn't hard to pick up a trail on her. He just had to flash a photo, and most people in the various gambling dens they searched would recognize her. He could only imagine why. It was following the leads that proved nearly impossible. Tsunade seemed to have a habit of leaving in the middle of the night without informing anyone of the hotels she stayed at. It made figuring out where she was going problematic. The only advantage they had was their speed. Tsunade meandering around at about a civilian pace, according to whatever whim drowned her. They, on the other hand, were about to zip between towns in a fraction of the time. Unfortunately, this meant their only solution was to try and nail down a timeline of the slug Sonin's visits by going to every nearby town in turn, then repeating that process while hoping she wasn't getting even further away. After a few days of this, Naruto was even beginning to figure out the beginnings of a pattern. Tsunade had a tendency to visit larger towns when she could, better gambling dens and finer alcohol, and only made for the smaller fringe villages when the heat from her various debtors became too much. Right now, despite their own pursuits, Tsunade hadn't caused much trouble in a way, so she was a lot more likely to head to the bigger flashier casinos. When they slowed from their grueling pace at the outskirts from of Maze Guy, the red-headed Hokage was feeling optimistic. After a few moments to give his team time to recover, they were needing less and less of that as the week progressed. They ambled into the town with all the nonchalance that only trained ninja could properly muster. There appeared to be some form of festival going on, although that wasn't too surprising. Every town had their own traditions and special days, and they were all looking for any excuse to attract tourists and bump off a day or two of work. The sundown was still a few hours away, so only a handful of people were pursuing the stalls, most of which were still being set up. So the shinobi quartet didn't draw too much attention as they threaded through the streets towards the seedier area of town. They were sure to find the gambling halls. It took another hour of scoping out Chohan games, knucklebones, and a number using Karuta before they struck lucky, sort of. They were passing their fifth gambling hall of the evening when they heard a commotion from the other side. Before they could even investigate, a man's head suddenly broke through the wall, looking suitably dazed for somebody who had apparently just headbutted a few inches of plaster. His eyes widened in horror a few moments later as the rest of his body promptly joined him in a shower of dust and wall fragments. He was promptly followed by a fretting young woman in short, dark hair who, for some reason, was clutching a pig. "I'm so sorry about this. She's usually much better at restraining herself." Naruto and his team took all this in with a quiet sort of a bemusement. The redhead noted that the village records of Shizune Kato were wildly out of date. She had grown up a lot from the younger girl Tsunade had absconded with just before the Third Shinobi War. As if by clockwork, the young woman's master was quick to join them, climbing through the hole she had made with a drunken elegance that was only countered by years of hardwired shinobi reflexes. She still managed to trip over a bit of loose debris. The Sanin wasn't what Naruto had expected. Hiruzina had warned that she had a tendency to change her appearance around to throw off pursuers that weren't well versed in Genjutsu. Still, he had been expecting a woman of middling years, bearing the proud stature suitable of somebody with her storied past. He should have known better than to put stock in such legendary features. Jiraiya was Exhibit A on that front. Instead, Team 7 saw a woman who didn't look much older than Uncle stumble out of the gamble den. "That's Jiraiya's teammate," Ame asked, bewildered at the sight of the young woman berating the battered man with a drunken slur. She was trying to reconcile the image she had the Toad Sanin with the bombshell blonde before them. The woman who was supposedly Tsunade wore clothes that would have made Naruto's fiancée proud, with a revealing white top and red skirt over mesh underclothing. The only thing that probably identified her was the iconic blue diamond on her forehead and the jacket draped over her shoulders that bore the kanji for gamble on the back. Shizune finished healing the man just in time for Tsunade to launch her now empty bottle of sake at his head, getting him to sprint away like he had glimpsed hell itself. Naruto chose that moment to make their presence known. Tsunade Senju. Hitsuzune took notice first, her eyes widened wide and panicking as they flickered between the Konoha team and her mentor. Tsunade lacked even that much situational awareness, and she took a few moments to turn ponderingly. It looked as though any faster would have caused her to fall over, and glared at them suspiciously. Who's asking? The tone was more than a little confrontational. Naruto's gaze flitted between the two women and the hole in the wall where even now patrons from the hall were beginning to peek their heads through the watch through to watch the confrontation with a kind of morbid curiosity. There was also the owner of the gambling hall lamenting the destruction of his property, but he was going largely ignored. Perhaps we could move somewhere a bit quieter, Naruto suggested, earning a surprisingly grateful look from Shizune. It took a fair amount of coercion from her illegally older ward, um, it, from her illogically older ward, but they eventually managed to get Tsunade situated in the far booth of a nearby bar. Apparently, all it took was the promise of more liquor. If that was the case, then getting the woman back to Konoha might not have been such a problem. Unfortunately, the moment he brought the idea up, Naruto had to compare the sound the blonde made to a large piece of fabric being torn in half a few times. You shouldn't be finding this funny. I'm very serious. It's time for you to come back to the village. He thought his voice conveyed that quite well, so that I seemed to disagree. Or what exactly? She declared with all the swagger afforded to her by her blood alcohol content. Naruto had a certain tolerance for people taking advantage of his goodwill, or even the occasional joke at his expense. If he didn't, Uncle would have been found strangely in her sleep. Uncle would have been found strangled in her sleep years ago. That tolerance wasn't without limit, though. So when his eyes narrowed slightly and an undignified pressure settled over the booth, his student quickly snapped out of their goggling over Tsunade's reputation, drunkenness, or bust varied between the three of them, and suddenly shifted away from their sensing. Or you'll be branded an S rank missing in under the authority of the Kondam Hokage, like you should have been years ago by your flagrant dereliction of duty for over 2 decades. You could have heard a fly gasp in the silence that settled over the bar, at least until Tsunade let out an undignified snort, nearly knocking over her drink as she bandaged the table. Oh, it's too funny when the young ones try to front up. Nato sighed and leaned back in the booth, the noise rushing back into the room like the returning ripple from a particular violent splash. You're clearly too drunk to talk to. We'll be back when you've sobered up a bit. Tsunade just jeered at him and slashing her drink expertly so that she didn't spill a drop. Yeah, good luck with that. Naruto stood up and made to leave, already planning how he'd position his team so that they could best watch the potential exits from the town. Tsunade wasn't getting away after all the trouble they had gone to track her down, only to pause as the woman quieted it. She was staring into her saucer of sake, idly tilting it this way and that, and watching her reflection shift and distort. So, the goat finally stepped down again. Who's the sucker who was stuck with that shit show? Naruto took a moment to debate the sort of continuing the conversation before sitting back down. You're looking at him? The blonde snorted childishly at the fact he'd called himself a sucker before tilting her head up to look him over him. You don't look like much. What's with the dumb coat? She managed to get a twitch out of the redhead for that, especially considering that the Hiyori she was wearing wasn't this similar to his. I suppose you'll be the one sending the goons after me when all this goes officially. Naruto tilted his head. She didn't seem all that concerned with being on the run. He supposed it wasn't all that different to the life she lived now. In fact, he could see her point, given her famed power and her experience evading people. There probably weren't many that could take her in. Jiraiya, the sentimental bastard, would probably refuse on principle. Instead, Naruto leaned across the table with a vindictive smile, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder so that she was forced to meet his steel gaze. I assure you, if I do put that order through, And I will. I'll be the one digging your trail every step of the way. The blonde met his stare without fear, grinning right back as she downed another swig of sake straight from the bottle. Seems like a lot of work for the incumbent Hokage. Don't you have some paperwork to go and drown in? Work depends on how attached you are to that coat. He shot back as he settled back into the booth. Tsunade gave him a confused look before glancing at her shoulder, just in time to watch a Hiraishin tag swirl into life. It took her alcohol haze of a mind a moment to recognize her own uncle's technique before she sneered, quickly sheathing the coat and throwing it at the redhead's face and standing off. There you go. Enjoy the show, will you? While you can. She settled out of the booth, pulling Shizune with her. Because next time you track me down, I'll start by breaking every bone in your arm. She absently crushed the sake bottle in her hand. And there are a lot of them. Tsunade-sama, please. To everybody's surprise, it was Sakura who called out, definitely climbing out of the booth to stand in front of the legendary medic. There are so many in the hospital who could use your help. So many medics who could be that much better with your teachings. The blonde gave the girl a searching look, taking in her neat the clinical appearance and the telltale signs of medical equipment in her pouch. You you get your kids to get to fight your battles now? Tsunade asked, not even turning to address Naruto. You're fitting into your position already. She shouldered past the disillusioned pinkhead easily, only pausing again when Naruto called out. It doesn't have to be this way. Hirusune is basically gifting you the hospital, free run of how things work, entire overhaul if need be. He wants his student back just as much as the village needs you. To her credit, Tsunade didn't turn back, if only to flip the redhead off. On second thought, maybe you're not such a good Hokage. The sweet talk is supposed to come after the threats and negotiation. Naruto had risen to meet her, undaunted by her narrowed eyes. Yeah, I was always more of a doer than a diplomat. I'm still learning that part. Besides, I've read all about you, what the village took from you, what you've lost. I didn't think you'd come back just because a few bounty hunters were after your head. It was mostly for the old man I even bothered. So, are we done here? Tsunade growled, already turning to leave. What I had heard, though, was that you were a gambler. Tsunade stopped in her tracks. What of it? Well, how about a wager? Are you all right? So Sakura asked Tsunade's apprentice, Naruto's three students, and the pig, who had been introduced to Tauntaun at some point, stood at the edge of the small garden. You don't look too worried about all this. She motioned vaguely to Tsunade and Naruto, who had taken up in the middle of the garden across from one another at a large stone table. No, I'm just sort of resigned to it at this point. Indeed, the young woman seemed to be fretting in a remarkable controlled, practiced manner. Tsunade-sama does what she wants, and I'm just sort of here too. Well, I'm just sort of here. Ami frowned from the other side of Sakura. That doesn't sound right. Shizune's eyes widened as she instantly began backtracking her other words. Oh, don't mistake me. Tsunade-sama is a wonderful woman. I learned more from her than I could have imagined. She only really gets this way when the memories become particularly bad. Otherwise, she can be quite lovely. Yeah, but what about what you want to do? Ami soldered her with all the tact that Uncle had forced out of her. Shizune simply took on a wistful smile at that as she glanced back to the main event. What about your sensei? Naruto seems like a remarkable man himself to challenge Tsunade in a contest of strength like this. Sakuranami shared a look at that. Sasuke might have joined in, but he was somewhat busy scrutinizing the pig sitting in his lap with a perplexed expression. Why is this pig wearing a pearl necklace? Yeah, that's Naruto sensei, Ame answered, ignoring Sasuke completely. Um, Unpredictable as ever. But do you really think he can win? Shizune asked, glancing back at the pair. Somehow, the poor bartender had been roped into all of this and was going on admirably impressed. And was doing an admirable impression of a rabbit stuck in front of a fire jutsu. I mean, I know Tsunade-sama has a reputation when it comes to gambling, but in arm wrestle, Ami and Sakura shared another look before shrugging at the same time. It's Naruto sensei. Sure enough, the two in question were just squaring up with their arms on the table, the nervous bar owner glancing between them furiously. You ready to have those arm bones crushed earlier than expected, Namikaze? Tsunade asked, wearing a savage grin as she clenched and unclenched her hands expertly. Naruto, on the other hand, looked quite neutral about the whole affair. Just as long as you're still clear on the rules. Yeah, yeah, best 2 out of 3. You win. Her eyes betrayed just how likely she thought that was. I go back to the village and take up as chief medic. And when I win, Konoha pays off my gambling debts and leaves me the hell alone. Naruto nodded his affirmation and noted for the bartender to do his thing. Locking hands with the grinning Sanin, the barkeep, placed his hand atop theirs, and after a quick uttering prayer, began countdown. 3, 2, 1, go! The slam of Tsunade's hand hitting the stone table could have made the daimyo's court silent. For everyone watching, it was as though both their arms were upright one moment, then flat to the side the next, to at no point occupying the space between. Both Tsunade and Shizune were staring at it, open mouths, while Naruto's students looked on smugly from the sideline. Fast. The Sannin recovered quickly, glaring across the redhead. You cheated! Naruto stared right back, now sporting a smirk of his. We're shinobi. There's no such thing. Tsunade reset her features and put her arm back up. Well, it won't work a second time, and Naruto could see that it wouldn't. The muscles in her arm were already tensed when they locked fingers. Luckily, that wasn't the only trick in his bag. 3, 2, 1, go! This time the last word was drowned out by the sudden flare of power from both shinobi. A thin aura of yellow enveloped Tsunade, clearly hoping to overpower Naruto in an instant, just as he had her, but the Namikaze was holding on admirably, his skin starting to turn red as he unlocked the first 3 inner gates. It was a technique he didn't like using, thinking it too short-sighted and damaging for the advantage it gave. Still, he had explored a lot of avenues for increasing his speed when he was younger. Currently, 3 gates was as far as he could go. He would have to do something to thank Guy when he got back, maybe giving him some way to track down Kakashi. It still didn't seem enough, though, as inch by inch his hand was forced down. 3 gates were a lot, but against the Sanin's raw, unmatched strength, he might as well have been doing nothing at all. It seemed inevitable when his hand finally touched the stone table, cracking it slightly under the pressure of their combined aura. Both let go instantly, Naruto quickly locking his chakra back down again as his skin returned to its normal tanned hue. The gates, huh? Nice trick, Tsunade said, with all the swagger of somebody who thought victory was already theirs. And not my last. Naruto shot back, pulling his arm back up without hesitation. It took them a moment to realize that nobody was coming to adjudicate the contest, as the bartender had passed out at some point during their last exchange. Instead, Amy bounced over, cheerfully putting her hand over theirs. Kick her ass, Sensei, she declared, quickly moving on before either could react. 3, 2, 1, go! Through though through exuberance alone was her voice heard over the sudden wave of barely restrained energy the 2 powerful shinobi released. Naruto instantly unlocked all 3 gates again, but Tsunade simply let her hand stay where it was, taunting him with her immobility. She didn't even try to push him down, meeting his eye with a victorious smirk. The moment she did, though, he made sure she regretted it. In that single moment of distraction, he went through the first 2 steps of creating a Rasengan in the hand that was currently collapsed against Tsunade's. In the time it took the signal to travel from her hand, that her grasp had been almost forcibly loosened by the sudden outpouring of spiraling energy up to her brain, Naruto had already forced her hand down onto the table with the dull thud of a tomb being sealed. There was one long moment of utter silence in the little garden before the slab of stone they were using as a table gave a suffering groan and split clean in two. I win. End of chapter 39.